Good evening. We welcome you tonight to our Tzemach Institute program. Normally, Mr. John Klein is with me to help with this program, and he had to be out of town today, so I have invited one of the men of our congregation, Dan Watson, who is a retired naval officer and has expertise in some of the areas that we really want to discuss tonight. So we welcome you tonight, Dan, to our program.
Well, thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the topic for tonight's program bears great interest to me, and I think it will be an interesting program to our viewers and that they're going to come away with some insights.
I believe so. The basis of our program, actually, I was stirred over the weekend as I considered some of the events that were taking place. I had time to watch a program on TV, which I seldom ever do, but I caught the leading episode of Ken Burns' special on World War II, and I was looking forward to it because I really appreciate some of the documentaries that he's done. I think he did one on the Civil War and also Lewis and Clark, if I remember correctly, and so they're very, very good. And this one, as it started out, was also that, joined with the fact that the president of Iran was coming to the United Nations and had been invited to speak at Columbia University. And so I think Mr. Ahmadinejad, as the leader of Iran and a potential leader of all of Islam, the dovetailing of these events, focus on World War II and some of the events there and what Mr. Ahmadinejad may represent, was the basis of trying to pull these things together and to consider them tonight.
Well, absolutely. The idea that these two things are just pure coincidence is typical of a modern viewpoint of events that take place. However, there's a message connected between Ahmadinejad visiting and espousing those principles that he so firmly believes in, and the atrocities that took place in World War II that Ken Burns is so craftily displaying for us in his special. So as we look at these two and look at the parallels of what could be going on, we can gain insight. And I know, Ken, that you've done the research on it, and we can start looking at the World War II in Europe and how the Nazis and their regime resemble this modern philosophy that Ahmadinejad so well represents.
Yeah, we want to present the thesis that the same basic thing that provided the systematic a pattern of thought that propelled the Germans and the Japanese toward the atrocities that we look at and are documented by Mr. Burns are very, very possible in Islam for exactly the same reason. So we're going to be developing that thesis tonight, and we want to contrast that to what I would call real biblical revelation when a person really meets God and the impact that has upon them. So that's where we're really going with the program. All right, if we look again at the special on World War II, obviously he documents the atrocities by the Germans, the Nazis in Europe, especially directed at the Jewish people, but many others also. And now Dan's more of an expert on the Japanese end of the thing. So how about the Japanese? How did they fare in this matter?
Well, the Japanese code of the warrior, the Bushido code, was in fact well established through the history of Japan down through the centuries for what they expected from their warrior class. It was a very detailed, strict, and highly organized code. Now, the Japanese had brought this to such a level by the time we're in World War II that any other human beings that did not adhere to this code, accept it, respect it, and follow the code, were literally considered to be subhuman beings. They did not have the same status. If we look at the Bataan Death March in the Philippines, the first example, first encounter of this of American soldiers, it became obvious that once they surrendered, the Japanese gave them no status. So they were just treated horribly in this death march. We don't even know the exact numbers of soldiers and sailors that died in this march. There's estimates on it, but that's not the point. The number's not the point. It's the fact of the attitude of the Japanese when they had these people in complete position of subservience and how they treated them.
I remember one of the accounts that was in this documentary was that obviously they had no food or water. I believe it was like for 10 days on a march, and the people was already weak to start with. And so one of the men that had survived that march was talking about a fallen soldier alongside the road, and army trucks, Japanese army trucks coming along and purposely swerving to run over them, and it was just, and then they were laughing in the process. It was just sport to them, and so what we're looking at are cultures or religions that develop this mentality of a superior class of people and count their opponents as subhuman. Now, certainly that was the case in Europe. We all know, obviously, of the Nazis and the supposedly superior Aryan race, and as a result of that, they were able to look with scorn on what they referred to as Untermenschen, or the under people, or subcultures. The Jews in particular were seen that way, but many others were also. So we have the documentation in the sense of the Jewish people of something like 6 million that were slaughtered during World War II. But we have, I think you mentioned the Slavs, and we have many others that were just eliminated, just butchered, seen as subhuman, and treated likewise.
Absolutely. The Russians suffered incredibly at the hands of the Germans. If any Russian people were left behind and the German lines overran them, they were typically just rounded up and slaughtered and buried. And today we're finding, it's reported now that in Poland there are mass burial grounds where it has been revealed that the German troops, when they captured the Polish army, they just rounded them up and machine gunned them and buried them.
Right. So what spurs the notion in human beings that they could become so absolute cruel? Obviously, war is horrible, and I know personally I've been fortunate in my life that I missed the major campaigns. I was in the military, but not in an active zone. I got out of the military. I was discharged just as Vietnam was really coming on the scene. And so I was blessed to avoid that direct military contact. But obviously people are, it's brutal beyond description. But societies like the Japanese and the Germans go beyond just brutality to these mass atrocities that we're seeing. Now, we've talked about, I think most everybody is superior with or is familiar with the idea of the superior Aryan race and the implications of that. Dan, again, let's talk about the Japanese and the samurai code that led to that same viewpoint in the Japanese.
Well, as a code for warriors, you see this as a code of honor and a samurai code. However, you can't excuse it with that and allow it to be considered primarily just a warrior code, because the Japanese carried this over. Many people thought the Japanese had a racial bias against Westerners from Europe or the United States. But if you were to ask the Chinese in the 1930s whether they thought the Japanese had just a racial bias against the Westerners, they would have taken exception, because the Japanese, in their war to occupy China in the 1930s, committed atrocities which had never been seen outside well, they just had not been seen in that way in the rest of the world. And the world stood by and watched as China suffered, but that was the times. But what I'm getting at is that you cannot excuse this as simply a warrior code. It became an attitude of superiority that was so ingrained that any other race of people that opposed the Japanese were treated as subhuman. Not just the prisoners you capture that are warriors that surrendered, but civilians who were massacred in Nanking and Shanghai in China. So these types of philosophies of superiority quickly develop into an onerous philosophy of that we can do no wrong and we are superior, and anyone that opposes us has no standing.
Do we have any idea how many Chinese civilians were massacred by the Japanese in that era? We're talking about the mid-late 30s?
It goes from about 31 through the war. Estimates run from 4 to 8 million, depends upon who you read and what you read. But the Chinese themselves would put it even higher at 10 to 12 million. But the historians use numbers from 4 to 8 million. But this is an incredible amount of people, and many of them are killed indiscriminately by the Japanese as they overrun Chinese cities, what would be normally the refugees. They just have no mercy.
Okay, so again, we're talking about atrocities. Now, Ken Burns his documentary is documenting indeed this very thing, atrocities that are committed by societies that and peoples, religious groups, however we classify them. In the case of World War II, we're talking basically about the German culture and the Japanese culture that led to this idea of a superior race, and their oppositions were seen as subhuman, and therefore killing for sport was acceptable because, after all, these people were subhuman. Now, we want to go from that to the idea that there is a growing threat today in the world that we're beginning to really come to grips with, that harbors the exact same attitude of a superior group of people, and that is that we see in Islam. The Quran promotes the exact same attitude in Muslims that we see exhibited in both the Germans and Japanese during World War II. And if you're not Muslim or non-Muslim, then according to the Quran, you're committed to wage jihad or holy war and subdue and kill the undermentioned, so to speak, the subhuman, the infidels, the non-believers. Now, the Quran, and we're going to demonstrate with some excerpts from the Quran. We're going to demonstrate what we're talking about. But due to the concept of election and the idea of submission to Allah, election, and predestination, unbelievers are seen as condemned by Allah. They believe the Quran supports the idea of God's absolute will and predestination, and those judged who refuse the revelation, so to speak, are considered only worthy of death. And so we see the foundation for the same types of atrocities through Islam that we saw in World War II. We want to look at a few excerpts from the Quran. We're going to project it and read it. Now, the first one we're going to look is the judgment that comes on the one that the unbeliever, the one that rejects the revelation of Allah of the Quran. This comes from Surah chapter 4, Surah 4, I guess I should say, verse 56. Danny, if you would read that, please.
Those who reject our signs we shall soon cast into the fire. As often as their skins are roasted through, we shall change them for fresh skins, that they may taste the penalty, for God is exalted in power and wise.
So this is anyone that rejects Islam. This is their fate. They're doomed to incredible torture, and so it's very easy to extrapolate. They're already doomed. They're less than the Muslim, and so therefore they can be treated as such. Now, the Quran goes ahead and makes the assertion that Allah and Muhammad have even turned some people into apes and swines. We're going to read from Surah 5, verse 63. Dan, if you'd read that one.
Say, shall I point out to you something much worse than this, as judged? By the treatment it received from God, those who incurred the curse of God and his wrath, those of whom some he transformed into apes and swine, those who worshipped evil.
Okay, now this is again the building the foundation for the idea that anyone that would not accept the revelation of the Quran or accept Islam, God, Allah, transformed some of them into pigs, swine, whatever, apes, and so we hear the charge over and over again today that the Jews are literally apes, and that's where that notion comes from. And then finally, the treatment of women. We're going to read from Surah 4, verse 34, and get a notion of how we should treat our wives in Islam. Notice that most of us don't do this because I think my wife would shoot me, I think. But anyway, let's read from the Surah 4, 34, treatment of wives.
As to those women on whose part ye fear disloyalty and ill conduct, admonish them. First, next, refuse to share their beds, and last, beat them lightly. But if they return to obedience, seek not against them. Okay,
so in this case, we're admonished to beat our wives, lightly, of course, but but beat them. Now, one of the things that always amazes me is, we have a lot of people in the United States today converting to Islam, and maybe if I were really a reactionary against our society as a man, I might consider converting to Islam. It is amazing to me that any woman would ever convert to Islam voluntarily, although some do. Now, one of the fundamental tenets of Islam that we want to consider is that it must be considered superior. Dan, you want to talk about that a bit? What does that mean? Islam must be demonstrated superior.
Well, Islam is not, you are not authorized, if you're Islamic, to take a second seat. If you are in a position where you interact with non-Islamic people, you must be in a position of superiority. There is one caveat in that allows for Muslims to live in a minority, but when they have the majority, wherever they are required by the Quran to show superiority, take charge, and to, in effect, rule using Muslim law, the Sharia law. Now, so when you have Muslims that live in a position where they are not superior, this is actually an infringement, if you will, upon their ego. It bruises their ego, and in their way of looking at things, they need to have satisfaction of that bruised ego by returning to superiority and punishing those who prevented them from being in superiority.
This would appear to me to render any kind of idea of a peace process in Israel absolutely absurd, because we have right in the middle of the Islamic world a Jewish nation, and we have Islamic citizens that are being effectively ruled by Jewish people. And so the idea that that can somehow be negotiated into some sort of peace is absurd. It really is irritating to me to see world leaders continually attempting to maintain some sort of semblance of that. Now we want to go quickly and look at this thing about Islam and Ahmadinejad. I believe that I don't believe that Ahmadinejad is the type of leader that would pull together all of Islam. But I think the ones that are behind his power might possibly be able to do that. Osama bin Laden, for example, has attempted to consolidate Islam and rally Islam against the West and restore the vigor, let's say, of Muhammad in the 7th century or whatever. He's been relegated to a cave in Pakistan. But what do we see in Iran? What do you see from a military standpoint emerging in Iran, Dan?
Well, Ken, the true leadership in Iran is the Grand Ayatollah, who basically allows Ahmadinejad to be his mouthpiece effectively. Now, when we look at Iran and their position, only Iran or Turkey, two Muslim countries with enough size and enough influence, could control the Middle East. Turkey appears to be at least tempered by their NATO alliance. Iran has no NATO alliance. Iran is in a position that if they can acquire nuclear weapons, they can intimidate the rest of the Islamic world into line and form the great caliphate, which is the goal of Islam, to create this unified Islamic caliphate that would then spread Islam to the rest of the world. So we look at the Iranian threat of nuclear weapons as being distant and not a direct threat to us. However, they are a direct threat to all the other countries in the Middle East by pulling them together into one great Islamic force, which then becomes a threat to Western Europe, Western civilization, the United States, and in particular to Israel.
So we think that with the warrior mentality that's evident within the Shiites, with the Shiite religious leaders in Iran, if they're given the possibility of nuclear weapons, then they would have the prospect of consolidating the whole Muslim world, which I think constitutes something like 1.5 billion people in opposition to the West, and they become a formidable thing then. Now, we want to, we're running short on time, but we want to go and look at, now all of these cultures have claimed to be superior. Islam claims to be superior because of the favor of Allah. The Germans stole themselves to be the Third Reich, or actually the kingdom of God. The Japanese, not biblically based, but they saw themselves in such superior position. We want to maintain that in the Bible, when a person meets God, rather than become one that dominates, he becomes a servant. We see Abraham in the very beginning of the story of redemption that we have in the Bible, Abraham meeting God. And God gave a number of promises to Abraham, but there's one very specifically that we want to look at in chapter 12, verse 3. Dan's going to read that, but Abraham becomes a special servant to all mankind.
It tells us, said, "And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed."
So God didn't say to Abraham, I'm going to make you a Superman and everybody is going to be subservient to you. Indeed, I'm going to reveal my purpose through you, and through that you're going to be a blessing, or that is to say, a servant to all mankind. Later, Isaiah would use the terminology that Israel is to be a light to the nations. That literally means that Israel is a special servant to all the nations. And then we want to look at Messiah Jesus himself, And Messiah Jesus made some statements that reveals exactly the same attitude. We want to read Matthew chapter 20 from the Gospels, verses 25 through 28, where Jesus talks to his disciples about becoming servants.
But Jesus called them to himself and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them."
Now, if I could interrupt you just a second, that sounds like just exactly what we described in the Bushido Code or the Aryan Nation or Islam.
Absolutely. He goes on to say, "It is not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many."
So Jesus maintains, therefore, if we are servants of the biblical God, the God of creation, of redemption, then we, by the very fact that we have met God, become servants. Now, the truth of the matter is, and I believe this refutes any validity whatever of Islam, the truth is, if a person meets God, and we see this throughout the biblical record, when a person meets God, the experience itself is incredibly humbling to that individual, and he becomes, therefore, first and foremost, a servant of God, and secondarily, he becomes a servant of mankind. He cannot be one that dominates because of the respect that he has for life. Dan and I were both talking earlier in life, we were hunters. And I don't think either one of us could kill an animal, perhaps with the exception of being desperate for food or something, perhaps.
Absolutely.
But certainly not for sport.
No.
When I was a teenager, I lived on the farm, went out in the country, we would go out and hunt, basically just for sport, because we weren't hungry. But I could not do that anymore because I met God, and having met God, I have a deeper respect for life, and so I couldn't even commit an atrocity for an animal, much less a fellow human being. I think that shines lights on not only the Japanese and the Germans of the World War II era, but also of Mr. Ahmadinejad and his aspirations today, and of Islam in general. That's our program for tonight. We want to invite you to come and join our class as we're studying in the Scriptures. Our first year class is meeting on Monday nights. Thank you for tuning in tonight. Shalom.